Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2021. We have received apologies this morning from Donald Cameron, and Emma Harper will join the meeting a little later than usual. Can I ask all members and witnesses please to ensure that mobile phones are on silent and all other notifications are turned off during the meeting. The first item on the agenda today is an evidence session with the Minister for Public Health and Sport on the following UK statutory instrument, the Health Security EU Exit Regulations 2021. And I welcome to the committee Marie Gougeon, Minister for Public Health and Sport, who is accompanied on this occasion by Laura McGlynn, Interim Head of Health Protection and Screening at the Health Protection Unit, Erin McCready, Team Leader for Environmental Health and Infectious Disease, and Ruth Fowlis from the Legal Directorate. Thank you for joining us today, and can I invite Marie Gougeon to make a brief opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I'm really pleased to be here today to answer your questions regarding the health security regulations, which Scottish ministers have been asked to give consent. And firstly, I'd just like to offer the government's apologies again for the speed with which you've had to consider the notification of these regulations. While we provided you with them as soon as we were able to, I appreciate that the situation isn't ideal, and I'm therefore grateful that you found the time to consider them today. And I hope that your efforts today will strengthen the health protection regime that we're trying to create. Now, as members of the committee will of course be aware, health security is a devolved matter. However, when the UK was a member of the EU, EU law by default created a strong system of cooperation and coordination between the four nations of the UK. Cross-border threats to health, for example, had to be notified to Public Health England, who in turn notified the EU. That situation has now changed, but the need for that kind of close cooperation between the four nations hasn't. And the UK also continues to have global obligations to meet, now under the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement and international health regulations. So that makes these regulations important for two reasons. Firstly, they'll ensure that there's a legislative underpinning across the UK for a coordinated approach to identifying and tackling threats to health security. And that means processes are in place to share information on threats, as well as also working together on solutions. And secondly, they ensure that the UK as a whole will be able to meet its international obligations. Indeed, failure to pass these regulations could be interpreted as the UK not complying with its obligations under the Trade Cooperation Agreement, which could have significant consequences both for the UK's access to important EU health institutions, as well as for the implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement more generally. So I'm therefore invested in ensuring that the committee and in turn Scottish ministers are reassured that these regulations are robust and that they're fit for purpose. So while I can't tell you that this agreement will allow us to fully replicate the benefits we derive from being an EU member state, it's already secured us access to key institutions for COVID purposes, and it's vital that we maintain that ability for other threats in the future. I think if the last year's taught us anything, it's that protecting the health of our populations can't be done by any government alone. It takes cooperation across borders and a willingness to share with and learn from one another. There's also been a close cooperation between the health agencies and the governments of all four devolved nations. In the last few months, officials have been meeting every fortnight as part of the Four Nations Health Protection EU Transition Group. And these meetings have helped to develop both these regulations as well as the common framework on health protection and health security. And I believe that the committee will have seen an outline of that agreement late last year. Now, work has moved on to planning for the practical operations so that we can continue to support and protect each other from health threats. And these regulations are an important foundation for that work. And I hope that the committee will agree and approve the proposal to consent to their laying in the UK Parliament. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much. And I think you've touched on the relationship between these regulations and the Public Health Protection and Health Security Common Framework. And Minister will be aware that this committee has taken a close interest in the common frameworks that have come before us thus far. There's not been an opportunity to consider this framework in advance of the regulations, which is regrettable, but the reasons for which you've explained. Can you indicate when, in your view, the Scottish Parliament will have the opportunity to scrutinise this framework?
Well, it had been our expectation that when we sent the technical summary of the framework outline agreement in December last year, that the framework would be available for scrutiny early this year. However, I know that the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution wrote to the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee outlining that there was a change to the timeline for the remaining provisional frameworks, and that meant that they weren't expected to be ready for scrutiny by Scottish committees before the autumn. And I think, as the Cabinet Secretary had stated in that letter, that wasn't in relation to a particular issue with one framework, but it was applied to the whole framework programme. And that was due to a wider issue of approval by the Joint Ministerial Council. So I'm pleased to say to the committee today that the Portfolio and Joint Ministerial Council ministerial approval for this framework has recently been given. So my hope would then be that the Parliament will be able to scrutinise that framework as soon as possible after the Scottish parliamentary elections.
That's clearly very welcome. I think the committee, our successor committee, will no doubt want to pursue the same approach in relation to the framework. Is it therefore your view, Minister, that there will be opportunities post the initial consideration of the framework? Will there be opportunities for ongoing scrutiny and amendment of the operation of the framework in which Scottish Parliament committees can engage? Minister.
Oh, absolutely. Much in the same way as there has been for previous frameworks that I know that the committee has looked at, and of course I've appeared in front of the committee in relation to one of the other frameworks previously. So yeah, it's absolutely my expectation that the scrutiny role for the Scottish Parliament will be fulfilled by the Health and Sport Committee at the start of the next session. But I would say that the framework will be provisionally operational prior to that scrutiny, but the framework isn't going to be finalised until any recommendations following that scrutiny have been taken into account.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Can I now call on David Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and to panel members. Given the divergence of the 4 UK nations in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic, how confident are you that this framework agreement and related concordat will ensure full equal cooperation in the event of any future health threats, pandemic or otherwise?
Minister.
Well, the aim of both the framework and the regulations is really just to ensure that that cooperation and coordination between governments and health agencies of the UK takes place. So in some areas that would mean that it ensures that there's a common approach to surveillance and monitoring of health threats. And our hope would be that it would also enable us to share best practice and learning. But I would say that, the framework does recognise that much of health protection and security is devolved, and it also allows for that divergent approach. So, for example, there wouldn't be anything to stop us, say, if we wanted to carry out higher levels of surveillance for particular issues that we thought were necessary. We would still be able to do that through the framework and through the regulations that are in front of you today. And where there is divergence, we would expect that the framework would help us to manage that in a coordinated and coherent way. And I would say that, on the whole, the framework essentially builds on the current practice and the way that we work together at the moment.
David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. My final question. Have discussions with other devolved administrations and the UK Government about its common framework, including learning from this pandemic, have included a consideration of an urgent review of public health and civil contingency legislation across the UK and in Scotland in particular?
Minister.
Discussions over the course of the last couple of years have been really wide-ranging. So, of course, the impacts of COVID-19 have informed them. But I think it's probably fair to say that they'll likely have a greater role to play in the operational aspects of the framework and how it's implemented. So the exact form that that's going to take is still to be determined. But, for example, there could be specific work streams within that which are dedicated to the ongoing COVID-19 response or to learning lessons to that response as well. In relation to civil contingencies legislation in Scotland and right across the UK, that legislation is well established, and our contingency planning has helped in dealing with the impact and the consequences of the pandemic. But of course, we would be looking to learn the lessons gained through this process and dealing with COVID-19 to see how we can better or further improve the national preparedness that we have here in Scotland, and doing that working alongside the other UK administrations.
Thank you very much. Sandra White.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister and other well, obviously officers there as well. Minister, in your opening statement, you mentioned the fact that health security is indeed a devolved matter in answer to the convener's questions also. And then following on from that, when we spoke about the framework, you mentioned the fact that it will be available, but at the moment it is not available in that respect. And also in answer to David Torrance's last question regarding the health situation and across the UK public health and civil contingency legislation, we said the exact form is still to be determined. So can I follow these questions up with a simple question? Are you confident that Scottish ministers will retain full responsibility for public health measures in Scotland?
Minister.
Yes, I am, and we just want to reassure members. Excuse me, I would want to reassure members of the committee as well that, just that I'd said previously, that this really builds on the strong coordination that we have with the other devolved administrations and the public health agencies as well. It's within our best interest to coordinate closely with one another. So the framework and the regulations that we're bringing forward really build on that. And I would say that the arrangements that we're looking at they don't change the scope of devolved powers. And they've really been established to ensure that we maintain that close cooperation and coordination. But the framework specifically, the framework specifically allows for divergence across the four nations. And again, I would say that ministers will remain responsible for public health, and the real benefit of these arrangements is that they ensure that the four nations just work together as equals to ensure a high level of health protection is in place right across the UK.
Thank you for that, Minister. This is my last question, convener. Obviously, we've been presented with this SI, and it has arisen in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Can I just ask, has there been full discussions on how other non-infectious health threats will be managed and considered, such as antimicrobial resistance for this SI?
Minister.
Well, work on this framework has actually started 2 years ago, so it started prior to the pandemic. So it had already been designed to be a vehicle that would tackle a wide range of threats, and it essentially takes an all-hazards approach. So to health protection and health security. So that means that it's really designed to tackle a broad range of threats which could arise from infectious disease, non-infectious disease, and other threats that cross borders, whether it could be in relation to radiation, a chemical threat, or environmental hazards too. And that also includes antimicrobial threats, and Schedule 2 of the regulations make explicit provision for those.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. David Stewart.
Good morning, Minister, and good morning to officials as well. My questions, Minister, are about the ECDC, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Now, the Minister will be well aware, of course, of the important job that the organisation has done since it was set up in 2004 within the EU. I've taken a particular interest in this over the years. As the Minister knows, it's been about improving public health, but particularly about a source of independent scientific advice, which of course badly needed during the current pandemic. So my questions, the first question to the Minister is there going to be a major gap in the market in Scotland and indeed the UK as a whole, because health protection measures now that the ECDC will have no role in this area within the UK?
Minister.
I mean, ideally, we wouldn't be in this situation where we've had to develop frameworks and look at that, because from a Scottish Government perspective, the ideal situation for us would have been to maintain access to these institutions as a member state within the EU. But in terms of the arrangements that we're looking at right now, rather than trying to replicate the benefits of membership of the ECDC, the committee is designed to be a part of the means that will still allow us access to that institution, because it is so vital, and it's really designed to bring that strategic coordination to the framework, and as a means of ensuring that we also meet our obligations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which the ECDC. So it's really on that basis that we're able to progress work on developing a memorandum of understanding with the ECDC, which we hope will give us ongoing access to it as a third country. But it's too early for us to say yet with confidence exactly what that MOU will result in or what that will look like. But the work to develop that has begun and it is ongoing.
David Stewart.
Thank the Minister for that answer. Minister, yesterday in preparation for the questions, I had a careful look at the ECDC budgets and indeed their staffing. I'll come to that perhaps in a second. They are, as you are aware, very substantial and they've built up considerable expertise since they were set up in 2004. So my question, Minister, is simply this. Is there going to be any functions of the ECDC which will not be covered by the new arrangements in Scotland? So let me give you some areas I'm particularly interested in. Surveillance, epidemic intelligence, or emerging vector-borne diseases. Are they going to be covered? And the other specific question, and I appreciate the Minister might want to write back on this since it's my last ever question, I'm being extremely fair this morning, is there going to be new budgets and new staff identified by the Scottish Government? Because these are major areas of work. Could the Minister give us some hints on this area? My experience in politics, for what it's worth, is you don't have budgets and you don't have staff, then you can all talk a good game. I'm not suggesting the Minister's doing that. I'm merely saying that's where the substance is in any policy analysis. So I'm really keen if the Minister would develop this, which is effectively my final question there, Convener.
Minister.
Thank you, and I'll try and answer as fully as I can, but if there is any further information that you want on the back of this question, then I'd be happy to write to the committee and provide that further information. Now, the committees that are being established aren't going to be able to replicate the full intelligence gathering capability of the ECDC because all of that draws on all member states for its information and intelligence. But the explicit intention behind this framework is really to maintain the system of cooperation across the UK that, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that EU law almost by default created. So by doing that, we'll be able to ensure that there's a strong system of intelligence and data sharing within the UK, but we'll also be able to ensure that the UK can meet its obligations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with the EU, as well as the obligations that it has under the international health regulations, because meeting those obligations is absolutely vital, because those are the means by which we'll still be able to gain access, albeit that would be on a case-by-case basis, to the EU early warning and response system. And it's also a key tool in helping us to develop the memorandum of understanding with the ECDC. Of course, again, as I'd said in my previous response, the Scottish Government's view is, we'd rather not be in this situation. We'd rather still continue to have our access as full members of the EU. And I think that was the best way of securing that full access. But now we're in the situation that we have to do everything we can to try and maintain that access by other means. And the framework, and in particular these regulations, are the best means for us doing that at this stage.
And sorry, Camilla, could I just press the Minister on the final question? Is there new budgets or new staff identified to cover these huge areas of responsibility that the ECDC were carrying out?
Minister.
Well, the regulation sets up a number of groups. There's the committee, there's the UK Health Protection Committee, there's the UK Health Protection Oversight Group as well. So there's equal representation across each of these bodies. In terms of a particular, so there will be, the Scottish Government will be represented, we'll have staff particularly on those groups. But again, this is about the coordination and builds on the work that we're doing already. So I don't know if officials have any further information about if there would be any further resource required that we would expect to see at the moment.
Can I invite Laura McGlynn to indicate if there's anything additional that she can add? Laura McGlynn.
Hi. So the discussion of budgets isn't one that's been had at the moment, because the work has been about drawing up the framework and drafting the regulations. As the Minister said, there will be an oversight committee and an oversight group. And the framework will be reviewed on a regular basis. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, please. Could you repeat that, please, for
the framework will be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that it is operating as we would want it to and with the resources that is needed. But as the Minister said, the aim of the framework is to build on what's there and to make sure that we recreate, I suppose, what was already there, rather than to try and replicate the ECDC functions.
Thank you very much. I now call Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Minister and officials. I want to look at the power to amend the list of diseases and health issues, and the current EU law list. Communicable diseases and special related health issues is to be replicated in regulation. The Secretary of State has been given the power to amend the list, but before we can make those amendments, he will require to obtain the consent of the devolved administrations, and also Secretary of State will also be required to have regard to any request by devolved authorities to make such regulations. Can I ask, therefore, what criteria will apply to decisions to amend the list of communicable diseases and special health related issues?
Minister.
The regulations don't currently make provision for that, but they do provide the routes by which the list can be amended. So it would really be my expectation that the UK Health Protection Committee would determine the criteria for that. But I would also hope that by the time the committee is able to scrutinise the framework, that there would be some more clarity and detail about that kind of operational issue, because that's the information that we don't have at the moment.
Brian Whittle.
Can I just clarify that? I just want to make sure that it is the intention that if there are decisions to be made around changing the list, that all devolved nations will be involved in that decision-making process.
Minister.
Yeah, as I mentioned, it'd be the committee that determine the criteria, and I think I'd mentioned or touched on that in a previous response as well, that the committee is made up of representatives of all devolved nations as well as their health agencies. There's equal representation across that. So again, I think this is an area where there will be more clarity and more detail coming forward, which I hope will be in place by the time the committee scrutinises the framework. But again, there is that equal representation there.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Just finally there, I think that the Minister's suggesting that the criteria is really yet to be decided, but presumably then what we're hoping here is in comparing with the existing EU law criteria, that there's something like that will want to be replicated, given that we're set to be out of that EU law revoked. So are we looking to replicate the criteria that the EU law currently has?
Minister.
Again, it's up to the committee to determine that criteria, but I think that's a reasonable assumption to make, that the EU criteria would be taken into account by the committee when it's considering what criteria should apply.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I call Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. I have no further questions. She's covered all the topics I was looking to ask.
All right. George Adam.
Well, that was a disappointing return from Mr. Cole-Hamilton after a 2-year absence. Okay, basically, I'd just like to ask the Minister, if the Scottish Ministers or the Scottish Public Health Agency wish to undertake additional surveillance for health protection purposes, how would that be achieved?
Minister.
Well, Scottish Ministers would be represented on the committee, so that means that we'll have a role in developing any recommendations that the committee makes. And the regulations also provide that where Scottish Ministers, if we were to unilaterally request that an amendment is made, the Secretary of State has to have regard to that request, especially considering that request alongside any committee advice. So beyond that, the regulations are designed to create a compatible and comparable level of surveillance across the UK. But my understanding of it is that so long as Scotland met the requirements that are laid out in the regulations, we could also conduct any additional surveillance that we consider necessary or appropriate.
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Minister. Can you see a situation where you might wish to make regulation to amend the list that wouldn't also apply to the rest of the UK, and how would you go about that?
Minister.
At present, it's difficult to think of a particular scenario right now where Scotland would want to act differently to the rest of the UK. But I would point out that Scotland can also maintain its own list of notifiable diseases. So the regulations are intended to make sure that there's continued sharing of comparable and compatible information with respect to those serious cross-border threats to health, and really enable that coordination and collaboration. And assuming that all those obligations are met, the four nations can still diverge in their public health responses. So if there were any unforeseen circumstances, there would still be the opportunity for us to have a process in place for a notifiable disease in Scotland that, say, wouldn't necessarily apply across the rest of the UK. But of course, our preference would be that the four nations would work together to complement one another. So that's where I hope that the framework will provide the mechanism for us to do that.
Thank you very much. Minister, the notification says that it is expected in almost all circumstances that the Secretary of State would follow the advice of the UK Health Protection Committee in making amendments. In what circumstances do you think it might be appropriate for the Secretary of State not to follow the advice of that committee?
The power to make amendments lies with the Secretary of State, and the wording of the legislation affords discretion as to whether to exercise that power or not. But the discussions that we've had and that have taken place between the four nations, we've been given that, provided that reassurance that the Secretary of State would in effect have a duty to act on the recommendations of the committee. So I would stress that the intention behind all of this is for a collaborative and cooperative approach, building on the collaboration and cooperative approach that we've developed already. And I would expect the amendments in the list to be made in that spirit. But I would also say that this is similar wording and a similar power that exists in other areas. And the discretion is included for what would be very rare circumstances where particular concerns beyond public health might come into play. But probably just in relation to the previous question too, it would be hard for me to think of a particular example where that may be used at the moment, because, as I say, the broad intention would be that the Secretary of State would have a duty to act on the recommendations that are made by the committee.
Thank you very much. And I call Emma Harper.
Good morning, Convener, and good morning, Minister and officials, and welcome back to colleague Alec Cole-Hamilton this morning. I'm interested in some issues around how Scottish interests will be reflected and represented on the Health Protection Committee, Minister, because it looks like in the proposals it talks about, in the framework summary document, it states that the framework also formalises the existing UK Health Protection Oversight Group and establishes the UK Health Protection Committee. These forums will bring together representatives from the UK Department of Health and Social Care, devolved governments and the UK's national public health organisations. So how will Scottish interests be reflected and represented in this committee, Minister?
Minister.
Well, the UK Health Protection Committee will consist of one member representing each minister from the four nations, and there'll also be one person representing each public UK health agency within that too. So for the details as to how that will operate, so for example, say that the terms of reference in that group, that's still to be developed, but at the moment it's expected that the committee would meet twice a year, and it would ultimately be accountable for the delivery of the framework. And the regulations also give it particular responsibilities, so for example, to review and advise on amendments to the list of communicable diseases where that would be necessary.
Emma Harper.
And it doesn't appear that either the Health Protection Oversight Group or the UK Health Protection Committee are statutory bodies. And I'm looking at the Public Health England's organogram on my iPad here as well, and I can't see it listed. So I'm wondering what the proposed arrangements are for like, how do we make it a statutory body, or is it a statutory body? How are we looking at this accountability and governance to be very firm and secure?
Minister.
I would just want to reassure the member and reassure the committee that the committee that we're discussing now will be established in the law through Regulation 4. So as I was stated previously today as well, much of that detail is still to be considered as we move from the work of creating the framework to fully implementing it. And ultimately, the committee will be accountable to the ministers of the four nations too. So I am confident that the membership of the committee will ensure that the governance structures will represent the interests of all four governments and all four public health agencies.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Minister. Just a final quick question. So I'm basically seeking assurance that the voice of Scotland will be heard and very strong within this committee arrangement, just to make sure that we do have a say in how public health measures, especially when we're looking at like maybe new viruses, new arrangements, new cooperation that's required. So I'm just seeking assurance that Scotland's voice will be very firmly heard.
Minister.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what's been really important about the work on this framework as it develops, as it has been developing, because it's really built on the strong cooperation and collaboration that we have across the UK. And it's about the four nations working together on an equal basis. So I understand the member's concern and the seeking reassurance on that point, but I would say that Scotland will play an equal role together in this. Each government and each public health agency will have representation on this group and will have equal representation. So Scotland's voice will certainly be heard within these committees.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That concludes questions to the Minister. Can I thank the Minister and her officials for their attendance? We will take a view on these matters later in the meeting, but in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us, and we will move on. In a moment to that. As this is the last meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in this parliamentary session, I would like to offer those members who are not seeking re-election an opportunity to say a few words reflecting on their time on the committee. I'd like to invite, in the first instance, David Stewart to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's perhaps an oxymoron asking me to do a few words, but I'm very happy to say something at my last ever question. Like many members, I've been on a number of committees and indeed in a couple of parliaments, and I've certainly probably enjoyed this the most. I've always been interested in health, but I think what was fascinating was the dynamic within the committee. I think irrespective of our party political views, we all got on extremely well together. And remember, for example, when the officials and Emma and Brian visited Westminster, where we became full members for the Scottish Affairs Committee for one meeting, which I think is very unusual in my experience in Parliament. But I thought I'd said something in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way that we were all staying at the Mad Hatter's Hotel in Blackfriars Road, but I don't know if that reflects anything at all on the committee. But I think looking at our annual report, I mean, we've worked very hard as a committee. I think we've had excellent officials led by David, and I think also I've personally learned a lot from the witnesses, both in the formal sessions and also the way we looked at things informally. For example, I think Convener and I were in Inverurie, where we spent the whole day effectively planning the health service of the future, and that I felt that was very unusual. So it's about having an open and accessible Parliament, which is really important. I'm sure the new MSPs in the new session of Parliament will look carefully at that. So finally, I'd just like to thank you, Convener. You've been an excellent convener, worked extremely well, and all the other members of the committee and all the clerks and all the witnesses. It's been a really enjoyable, I think, 3 years I've been on this committee, and I could safely say it's probably been the best Scottish Parliament committee to be a member of. So thank everyone for their cooperation, and keep in touch. And it's been a pleasure being a member of the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. And I call Sandra White.
Oh, thank you very much, Convener. Like David, I must praise the clerks and everyone on the committee. David, the clerks and Spice, the information we've been given has been absolutely fantastic. A committee is only as good as clerks and the information you get, the convener as yourself. convener, and also the members as well. As David had said, we all come from different political parties on this committee, and we don't always see eye to eye as most people in any committee, but this committee actually has worked very, very hard to ensure that at the end of the day it's a consensual committee, and that's down to the good convenership and the committee members also. What I have found really interesting about this committee is I didn't come on at the very beginning, but came in and sort of at the middle of the committee, and it really has reached out to the public, the ordinary people, and I think that probably has been the most enjoyable, apart from the fact that we've had so many SSIs, so much legislation to get through. It's been a really, really busy committee, but it's worked so well, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be there with you as convener also. And I just wish the clerks and everyone else who are continuing on in the committee the best for the next session. And thank you so much for all the help you've given me and obviously other members of the committee. And I'm sure the legacy paper that we produced has been very honest, very upfront, critical in some points and not in others. But it's a great legacy paper that this committee has produced. And I just hope that the next Health and Sports Committee pick up on some of the things that we've put forward, because they're really, really important for the health of Scotland as a nation. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you to both colleagues. This is also my last meeting of a parliamentary committee, so I would also like to thank fellow members of the committee, past and present, for working together to deliver on a shared strategy and vision over the last 5 years, and mention in particular my deputy convener, Emma Harper, and the previous convener of the committee, Neil Findlay. It's also the last committee meeting for the clerk to the Health and Sport Committee, David Cullum. David has been a senior official of the Scottish Parliament for over 20 years, having set up and led the non-executive bills unit since when he has been the editor of the official report, and in the last session was clerk to both the education and the local government committees. So my personal thanks to David Cullum for his support, and also for bringing his experience and his strategic perspective to the service of the Health and Sport Committee this session. And I know we will all join in wishing him a long, active and enjoyable retirement, starting very soon indeed. And thanks also to the rest of the team, the children either brought into the world or nurtured through lockdown by members of the Clarkton team would fill a workplace creche on their own. But despite those distractions and challenges, we have had tremendous support over the last 5 years. And while I couldn't possibly name all the excellent clerks who've worked with us, I should mention in particular Lara Donaldson, who has done a great job in keeping the rest of us on the right track. We have also had tremendous support from the researchers at SPICE, from the press office, from the external engagement team, who have been as innovative as we wanted them to be and more, and all the other departments without which Parliament could not do its job. Every session of Parliament to date has seen new challenges and questions for its committees, and I'm sure that next session will be no different. As both David and Sandra said, this committee has worked hard, focused on the bigger picture, to influence change and to engage with the wider public, and I hope that that work will be of value to our successor committees in the next session of Parliament. So thank you very much. The committee will now move into private session on a different platform in a few minutes' time, and I now suspend this meeting.